Welcome to Waking Up is Not Enough, Flourishing in the Human Space. Whether you awaken through meditation, spiritual practice, near-death experience, ingesting a mind-altering substance, or being born again, you still return to your messy life without any special instructions. In this podcast, Polly Young-Eisendrath and Michael Berger talk with scientists, spiritual teachers, and other experts about how awakening can connect to a new path for flourishing and development on which waking up is important, but not enough, and growing up is never finished. Polly and Mike bring different kinds of expertise to the conversation. Polly is a psychologist, Jungian analyst, mindfulness teacher, author, and longtime practitioner of Zen Buddhism, as well as the founder and director of the Center for Real Dialogue. Mike is an expert in psychedelics, an entrepreneur, a skeptic, a practitioner of Jewishness, a documentary filmmaker, and a real dialogue specialist. The Center for Real Dialogue produces and edits this podcast entirely through donations. We want to keep it available for free to our listeners. Our unique perspective needs to be supported by people like you. Please make a donation on our GoFundMe platform, introduce our podcast to family and friends, and support us on social media. We genuinely need the support of all of our entire community, and we're grateful for it. Diana Johnstone is an American journalist and political writer who's lived in Paris for decades. She's best known for her sharp critiques of NATO, U.S. foreign policy, and the ways media shape public perception in Europe. A former European editor of In These Times and press officer in the European Parliament, she's the author of Fool's Crusade on the Balkans, From Mad to Madness on nuclear war planning, and her memoir, Circle in the Darkness. Her work has opened important debates about dissent, narrative control, and the boundaries of free speech in Europe today. Why protecting free speech matters and what's happening now in Europe, a conversation with Diana Johnstone. In this timely and eye-opening episode, American journalist Diana Johnstone joins us to unpack recent restrictions on free speech in Germany and France. She connects these developments to broader global dynamics, including Israel, Ukraine, NATO, and the shifting role of the U.S. in Europe and the Middle East. Diana also reflects on the transformation of the European political left over the past 25 years, offering context that is rarely heard in mainstream discussions. Polly and I press into what's most ominous on the horizon for European and U.S. politics, and Diana's insights are, as always, deeply informed and refreshingly candid. Whether you're familiar with Diana Johnstone's work or encountering her voice for the first time, this is a must-listen conversation.
Hello, Diana and Mike, and welcome. I know a very, very hot day in Paris and a hot day in St. Louis, and here in Vermont, it's actually fairly cool. I'm sorry to say that I'm feeling good about the weather here and sympathizing with bad weather there. So actually, what we're going to talk about is not the weather. So Diana Johnstone, I love talking with you about what's happening in Europe, and what I'd like to hear about first is what is going on in regard to freedom of speech in France and Germany, if you want to talk about as well.
I will stick mainly to the countries that I'm most familiar with, which are France and Germany. And I want to give a bit of background, if I may.
Yes.
One can talk about what it is immediately, but the point I want to make is, first of all, that the European political class has been infantilized by World War II. This sort of is the background to explain things. You see, ever since, for 80 years, since the end of the war, Western Europe has been dominated by the United States. And it's gotten so that the political class, which is politicians and journalists, have all pretty much been vetted by American institutions and have just lost the capacity to think for themselves. And they sort of think in the rules that they get from America. And of course, now free speech is an American rule, but that's not the way it works. The Europeans, especially the French and the Germans, have adopted the American view of World War II to such an extent that they've made myths out of it. The U.S. dominates the version of events. Now, I'll give it one example of this, which is related, I think, and that is a myth of Munich. And Munich is cited to prove that you shouldn't negotiate with anybody. Now, you could take as a myth the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Adlai Stevenson at that time came up with the solution, which was to see that the Russians felt that we were doing the same thing that they were doing in Cuba, in Turkey, and that was the solution. And we could make an ideal of that, about how that crisis was actually ended by realizing, paying attention to the other one's point of view and working out a solution. But instead, Stevenson gets no credit. And it sort of said that, well, Kennedy was strong and then the Russians gave in. That's not the case. The fact is that the United States did, in fact, make a compromise after discussions and understanding of the other point of view. But that's discredited. Instead, you just talk about Munich, and that's what I mean. The other thing is the American version of the World War II has been also, of course, that the U.S. won the war by the Normandy invasion, which is, anybody who knows the history said that's Hollywood's version. It's not historical version. And then there's also the guilt of the Holocaust, or as the French say, the Shoah. And that also has negative effect on freedom of speech, because now there are historical reasons for the persecution of the Jews. I mean, there's Germany's loss in World War I, the loss of territory, the loss of emotional feelings, and the Jewish elite was felt as a sort of rival. But the myth is that, people were unhappy, so they just turned against people who were different. No, that is really a simplification that distorts reality. It's not just that they turned against people because they were different. They felt they were rivals and so on. And because they're different, then you mustn't, it leads to the ideology that you mustn't say anything about people who are different, that if you say it, it's going to lead straight to the gas chambers. And that is an origin of, you get these laws that really stem from the Holocaust religion. For instance, that in France in 1972, they adopted the Plevin Law, which was added to existing laws that guaranteed the freedom of expression of media, and limited it by bringing in laws to punish, well, what now you call hate speech. And this it's used very selectively. For one thing, hate is an emotion. It's not, but it's treated as an action, which it is not. And you say anything against immigrants, well, that's hate speech. There may be something you don't like about something that leaders of some group do, and that's called hate speech and becomes illegal. But I say it's very selective, because in fact, that law has a part that any organization which claims to combat racism can claim itself a partie civile, a civil party. Now, that's something in French law that I don't think you have in American law, but that is that they can, in fact, sue anybody who is chosen as for hate speech and collect damages as if they were personally damaged. And this is particularly a specialty of LICA. But in any case, it's used very selectively, because these organizations tend to choose people that are politically hostile. Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was their big ogre, was fined, all sorts of laws against him, for saying that the gas chambers were a detail of World War II. Now, in a sense, I don't know how you can say that's not a fact, but it's called, they sued it because he said it. I mean, really, they have gone against political enemies with these laws.
It sounds as though you're saying that there's a kind of emotional immaturity that has developed over the last 80 years and has tended towards a strong opposition between groups, and they may even be groups that are simply politically different, but that opposition now has taken the form that these people are speaking in the wrong way. They're speaking hate speech, even if it is something that's a fact, and that can be sued and that can be seen as illegal, or even is seen as illegal, as a result of a particular set of laws or laws that were put into effect around 1972. So that this has created an effect of not simply having, I guess, anxiety about speaking here in the United States, anxiety about speaking because you could lose your job, but there, anxiety about speaking on many different levels. And that has created essentially, and I'm getting at it in maybe an environment in which people are very reticent to speak in any kind of open way about their opinions, perhaps even. Am I getting the right
Well,
ideas here?
yeah, I don't know about the group, what's the groups, but yes, let me come a very famous example here in France. What is the comedian, the stand-up comic Dieudonné. Dieudonné was, I think, recognized by far the best comedian in France. His mother is from Brittany, his father from Cameroon, so he's half African, and he started out his career as a big champion of human rights and so on, until the 1st of December. And he was on a television show and he mimicked, in a very negative way, an Israeli settler who was a fanatic. I mean, he played the role of this fanatic. Now, this caused an absolute uproar. And the result is that there was he not only sued, but theaters were closed to him. Now, that was in 2003. It's now 2025. And Dieudonné has to give his show in a bus in a parking lot because no theater will let him play because the organized Jewish community objected. Now, because he's very talented and has a lot of supporters, he can still have a crowd in his bus, a small crowd in his bus. But an ordinary person that would be ruinous, you see. It's an example. He may survive because he's extraordinarily talented and stubborn and manages to survive. But you see, that's an example of the sort of thing if you make things hard enough for one person, it shuts a whole lot more.
Yes, his case is very famous. I have read about him, and I wasn't aware that he was so widely popular. But it sounds like he was very widely popular and then has been shut down to just performing in a bus.
Yeah, it took a long time because he had a theater where he played regularly, and then the owners said he couldn't play there anymore, that sort of thing. And then theaters all over France would not allow him. And so in France, the censorship or intimidation, because it's more intimidation than that, it has to do with Gaza. And there's a woman of Palestinian origin who is a member of a political party, the Les Insoumis. I mean, they're regularly calling for her arrest, all sorts of things. It's that is the most sensitive issue. Although there are other sensitive issues uh, in Europe generally. If you say anything against against unlimited immigration, it's considered racism. And that's rather recent, but it has to do with being against nationalism as being the source of it's always worried about it's a source of nationalism will lead to Nazism, which is not necessarily true at all. And of course, that's a way of idealizing the European Union because the whole point of the European Union is to give up your national identity and be part of Europe. And so all of the pro-European people work to censor criticism of no borders because no borders is part of the European ideology. And so that is another no-no that you're not supposed to. Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany was simply wanting to control immigration, not stop it, but control it. Some people, but it's become so that you have to say everybody can come in, everybody can come in. Well, that's never been the case of legal system. You've never just open borders. Anybody can just come in no matter what. There are procedures to go through.
What do you think is the actual opinion of a majority, for example, of French people? Do you think their opinion would be to protect the borders and to retain a national identity? I mean, I don't follow closely enough to know how, say, a majority of French people might be actually thinking.
Well, it's hard to know because the media go along with the official line, and particularly the left wing Libération, whose editor, by the way, is an Israeli who is a member of the Israeli Defense Forces. So there's a very strong. It's a difficult situation because France has the largest Jewish population in Europe. And this is related to the fact that the greatest number of French people who were not deported, but somehow or other, the strength of that community has created a great sense of guilt in France. That explains the domination of this repressive because of the guilt. Now, it's somewhat like that in Germany, but a bit different. I can explain that because it's not exactly the same. The French guilt is related to perhaps the strength of some official Jewish organizations that use these laws, for instance, to sue people for saying the wrong thing as partie civile, as civil parties. Now you ask what people really think. It's hard to tell. Right now, I think there's a great feeling of anger about what is happening in Gaza, especially among young people. Now, this is true everywhere, I think, but it has a difficult time getting any political expression because this party, Les Insoumis, which has expressed criticism of Israeli behavior in Gaza, is constantly attacked for supporting terrorism. That's the line. It's put in the terms of support for terrorism against privileged minority. I mean, if you can put it that way. The other parties don't say anything, and that party. There are other reasons people could not be for that particular party. It's considered far left. I don't know what that means.
I know that you, Diana, have written and also called yourself a progressive in the past, very much of a progressive in Europe and in, really for the poor, against war, and so on. And you and I have talked about how progressivism has changed in these last, say, couple of decades or more. That's true in the U.S. as much as it is true any other place. And so it's almost unrecognizable to think of what progressivism used to be and what it is now. But I wonder how you think about any of the old progressive values, which included free speech.
No, the free speech is absolutely the basis of it.
Right.
It's also the basis of the
Yes.
Enlightenment. I mean, my companion here, Jean, is a scientist, and in science, that's how you progress. You have
Yes.
differences, and you work them out. You decide this is the way it is, and then others come along and say, well, it's not exactly that. And that's the way science evolves. And social relations, freedom of speech is absolutely basic. I would say, for my values, I would say what I consider two values are freedom of speech and opposition to war. And
Yes.
and the fact is that goes along with an idea that you can work out your differences.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that means dialogue. And of
Yeah.
course, all of this clamp down on ideas, on debate, fosters war. It fosters conflict because if you can't work it out verbally, then the next thing you have Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the European Commission, was saying Putin, he only thing he understands is force. You start saying that everybody you are again, only thing they understand is force. You won't talk to them. You refuse to talk to them. You say all they understand is force, and you prepare to use the force. It's just an excuse for rearmament that we're getting now.
And do you think that's also, is France going in the direction, do you believe, to support some kind of, I don't know, war with Russia or that side of things? Is that happening in France?
I'll get to Germany where it is happening.
Yeah, okay, well, I mean, I wanted to stick with France for a few
No, in
minutes more.
France, it's completely against. It's totally. It shows the complete abandonment of the Gaullism, which was the moment of independence of France, and the two political tendencies in France that were for independence were de Gaulle and the French Communist Party. And the uprising, the funny thing is that the uprising of the youth in 1968 discredited both of them and brought in this hedonistic left, which is now dominant. And the hedonistic left is, you can do what you want, and that's it. It's all about individual freedom, individual assertion. And it diminishes the sense of social cohesion. And that is a trend, say, since 68 in France, is to move away from very strong, which remains with people, but the political class and the media have gone for this what I call the hedonistic left, because it's all about having a lot of fun and not caring about what other people consider. France has no historic reason to be hostile to Russia. They've been allied with Russia. Of course, Napoleon had a different idea. That was quite some time ago. And since then, France has been allied with Russia. It's not an enemy. And I don't think there is hostility here in France toward Russia at all. The difficulty is the political class, and particularly Macron, because Macron has no political ideals except Europe and banks, if I may say so. And I mean, he comes from banks and he's all for Europe. So he goes along with what seems to be uniting Europe. And of course, if you have a common enemy, that unites you. So if Russia can be the common enemy, that's what will bring Europe together. I think that's his reasoning. I think French people aren't even taking that much seriously. I don't think anybody in France really, I mean, you always have some people, but I mean, I am quite sure that the majority of French people don't even take seriously the idea of fighting Russia, even though Macron makes it sound that way.
I believe there are so many parallels in what I'm hearing you say, Diana, here in the United States with our current president and what's going on with Iran, and that we were in the, quote, middle of negotiations right before I'm not even going to put aloud Israel, because I believe Israel is now firmly in charge of American U.S. policy. But I want to jump back. Do you have any thoughts about who benefits in France from the unlimited immigration? Because I mean, this is an issue that the United States has been dealing with in its borders as well. So in power dynamics, who benefits from unlimited immigration? Why might the political class? How might factions of the political class benefit?
Well, again, this has been a switch, because I mentioned a while ago that before May 68, the dominant party on the left was the French Communist Party. And they were very much for limiting immigration, because for the benefit of the working class, basically. But then in the early 80s, Mitterrand was elected with the support of the Communist Party, but he very quickly dropped the common program of the left in order to conform to European economic demands. And when Mitterrand dropped his social program, they had to find another ideal, and that's when it became anti-racism. And then the left dropped its concern for the benefit of the working class and moved toward anti-racism. And it was decided that immigration, if you were against immigration, it was racist, which is a very large assumption. So it was ideologically the left that turned in favor of open borders to show they aren't racist. We're not racist. We want everybody to come in. And of course, the problem is that you've had people coming in who did not follow the processes of control, and you have people who are totally unassimilated and carry lives and stab people. I mean, just recently there are several cases of children, kids, somebody stabbing a teacher. Or it's very scary. I have my grandson working in the school, and I'm a little worried. This unlimited immigration, I don't think it benefits anybody. The right wing, which is against it, is called fascist. You see, if you're against it, you're a fascist. That was not a main issue of fascism, by the way. I mean,
you and I talked, Diana, about Michel Foucault previously we have, and France brought in Foucault and a kind of a destruction of power as a philosophical idea or even ideal. I see in the United States in psychoanalysis it had a big effect, and it was almost as though it was a movement only for destruction.
Yeah.
And that has played a big role in our identity politics, that what needs to be destroyed is power, but there's nothing to replace the structure of groups, government, borders. It's as though there is, I believe you and I did talk about Foucault. There was almost a philosophy that came in from France. It came into America, into universities and psychoanalysis, politics, and it was a philosophy of destruction. It's essentially burn down the buildings because they're not founded on the right principles, and then everyone is living in a burned down building. That's as far as it goes.
Well, Foucault he perfectly personifies what I say, the hedonistic left. You see, you're against the power closest to you, which can mean you're against your teacher, you're against your parents, because they're the power nearby. The great big powers of the military powers and the big economic powers are undisturbed by this. It's much more intimate. It just turns people against each other who are close to each other. But the big powers that are running things live with this very well.
Yeah, that's unfortunate and true, and it continues. And
Yeah.
I do think that for whatever reason, there was a French influence there that affected America. You were saying America affects, yes, I agree, all the media and all the advertising and so on. But also Foucault did affect America and affected our institutions really in a way that I wouldn't have predicted, because I thought the ideas were so destructive. And they've resided, though they've continued. And maybe because the larger powers almost support this kind of destructiveness among groups and individuals fighting with each other, and essentially, taking apart any kind of fabric of community.
Yes,
That
exactly.
would allow for the true, negotiation, dialogue, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's it. You see, I think that it does distract from the real powers that are shaping society in terrible ways, including militarism. It distracts from attention to all these real evils, and you don't want to talk about it. If you say too much about it, then we'll get to that with Germany too. Putin, you're on the side of the bad guy.
I've been listening to Jeffrey Sachs speak at the European Parliament and speak out against the United States, and I think he's being rather courageous in what he's saying publicly. So he's been advising the Parliament in Europe to have their own cohesive foreign policy, to not be, in my words, U.S. lackeys, to speak and negotiate directly with Russia, and that their primary objective should be to have direct talks to negotiate mutual security arrangements between Europe and Russia, and to not follow what the US tells them or instructs them or expects them to do. So I think he's very courageous for speaking out the way he is, and he appears to be on a marathon speaking out nearly daily now about U.S. foreign policy. I've heard him say openly that Israel is in control of U.S. policy, that there can no longer be any doubt with what happened with Iran, and that, Europe needs to go its own way at this point. It cannot continue, as you were saying in the beginning, to just allow the United States to direct what's going to happen in the European continent.
That's good. That leads me into stuff because, in fact, I admire Jeffrey Sachs a lot, and I listen to him often. But remember that he was not speaking to the whole parliament. He was speaking to a very specific group in the parliament. And the most part of parliament wasn't listening to him and isn't listening to him and has nothing to do with that. So that leads me into an observation, which is I know that a number of people wanted Trump to win the election for this particular reason. They thought he's so awful that it will make the Europeans turn away and think for themselves and become independent. The opposite has occurred. And that has been a big surprise to some people. But they thought the fact is that although they don't like Trump, they've actually become, with Trump as president, the Europeans have become more American than the Americans. It's very strange because the Ukraine project was designed by the United States with roots in Brzezinski, etc., precisely in order to put a barrier, a new iron curtain between Russia and Germany, so that they wouldn't combine German technology with Russian resources, and Europe would thrive without being controlled by the United States. So the whole Ukraine project was a project to assert and reassert American dominance of Europe. And so it is absolutely insane that when Trump turns away from that project, if he does, because you never know what he's doing exactly, but the moment he seems to be dropping the Europeans rush to protect it, to protect this project, which was designed against their own interests. I mean, it is crazy, but that's what you get when you don't have any dialogue, when people don't discuss anything, when you can't discuss anything because you mustn't agree with the Russian dictator, because every time we have an opponent, it's a dictator. You see this at this last NATO farce meeting, where the Europeans, led by this horrible Ursula von der Leyen and the new German Chancellor Merz and the new Mark Rutte, the new Dutch Secretary General of NATO, all planning to drop Europe's social programs and pour billions into militarization. This is completely insane. So, in fact, right now it has worked precisely opposite from how some people were hoping the Trump effect would be. It has actually made them, and then you saw Mark Rutte speaking of Trump as daddy. I guess you saw that, because Europe is just all the little children, and they're afraid that daddy will leave home. And so they say, daddy, stay with us. I mean, this is what I say, this is the proof of what I was saying to start with, the infantilization of European leadership. And this has been done through years and years of sort of training institutions like the Young Leaders program. You realize Macron and many have all passed through this Young Leaders program sponsored by the United States. They pick out ambitious people, I guess, and they promote their careers. And there's a German journalist who wrote, Udo Wolfkotte, who wrote about how he was really working for the CIA, and he died suddenly of a heart attack at the age 56. The inability of the Europeans, because the whole journalistic political class has been indoctrinated by American, and they don't know how to think for themselves. The bunch that's in, you'd have to have some kind of cultural, I don't know what kind of revolution to get rid of that tier of, and it's particularly bad in Northern Europe.
The NATO part of it is of real concern because of what's been happening And there does seem to be a relentless refusal to, it's almost like refusing not to go to war with Russia, as though people are wanting to go. And because Russia is not communist now, and it's not a feature of real concern from the point of view of something that would really attack the US or attack Europe, I don't quite get it. It's like a hatred of Russia that's been instantiated, or as you're describing it now. Of course, the setup for NATO was backed by the US. What happened in the Ukraine was really a US arrangement, and it's true that Trump does not seem to want to go forward with it, or had not seemed to, but now Europe does seem to want to go forward. So, I mean, what I have not been able to understand is why there's so much hatred of Putin. I listened to Putin's addresses. I listened to his attempt to appeal to a civilized kind of approach to things, and appealing in the Munich conference and wanting to be a part of Europe, et cetera, et cetera. An intelligent person, and I don't understand the desire to hate this, and it seems relentless. I don't know if it's the leftovers between Germany and Russia. That's what was left of World War II. That's what I'm not as informed as you, but just looking at it emotionally, it looks that way. It looks like it's an old fight, but I don't see how this benefits Europe at all to take on a war with Russia or to posture that way.
Yes, well, that's what I want to talk about. That's it, because first of all, I just want to say that even when Russia was communist, it was never going to invade Western Europe. That was a fake from the start. I mean, in 1946, Churchill went to a town in Missouri and said that this Iron Curtain going on. Well, of course, he was talking about separation, which is actually what he liked. It was not an invasion. It, Russia was getting a security zone. It was so far from threatening to invade that it dropped support to the Greek communists, which made Tito mad and led to a break with Yugoslavia because Tito wanted to support them. And Stalin absolutely gave orders like to the Italian communists, don't make a revolution. But so this Russian threat was a fake all along, which enabled the United States to rearm and to rearm Germany, because they wanted to rearm Germany and they couldn't do it without the Russian threat. So it's always been a fake. But this is what I spent a lot of time in Germany, and there's been a saying since, when it came to reunification in West Germany, speak of it never, think of it always. And you see, I was working as a journalist and covered the 1980s, early 1980s. There was a movement in Germany against the stationing of nuclear missiles in Germany. And I followed that movement very closely. It's how I got involved with the Greens finally, because the party was formed then as an anti-war party, which became the war party later on. The thing is, I was struck then by, you sort of had a change in illusion perhaps, but the Germans were changed now. They were so peaceful. And I was in Bonn when Gorbachev came there, and I shook hands with him. He had a very firm handshake. And I believe that this peace movement in Germany in the early 80s really did persuade German leaders, including Gorbachev first of all, that the Germans had changed, that they had become nice and peaceful. And so he said yes to reunification, gave up East Germany and the Baltic states and one thing and another. And I was taken in by that to myself because I was around people. But what comes along? Along comes the conflict in Yugoslavia, and all of a sudden, the left-wing Germans that I knew who had been saying, no more enemy images, we will be friends with the people. All of a sudden, they were hating Serbs, just like they did in World War I. And that war was when they went right back. And I have become very skeptical already, because I saw signs even at the time indicating that all this German peaceful thing was had some arrière-pensée, some motives behind it. And
Like hidden motives that were somehow connected to getting Germany reunited, but then not,
yeah,
yeah.
the U.S. started this project Ukraine, but the German leadership, and I name names, for instance, Ursula von der Leyen, Annalena Baerbock, Friedrich Merz. Annalena Baerbock speaks reverently of her grandfather who fought with the Nazis. Now, that was the child. First, you had the child generation, which revolts against his parents who were Nazis. Then you get the grandchild, and the grandchildren nostalgically to their grandparents who were the Nazis. And to my mind, what has happened is that they have transformed what was the US project of separating them into a revenge policy. And I am convinced that the leadership of Germany, now not everybody, in fact, quite a bit, not everybody, but the leadership is wanting to end World War II all over again with them on the Allied side against Russia. I just see symptoms of that. And the hatred, it's especially in Germany, is the hatred of Russia. They've been opera singers. And the fact that from the start of the problem with Ukraine, you had this insult to call Saravan Putin understanders, Putin-Versteher, as if understanding Putin is a crime. You know, this is the absolute low point of intellectual honesty, to say that understanding a major world leader is something you shouldn't do. And they've made it into an insult, a Putin understander. The persecution there of anybody who says anything decent about it's unbelievable. You mustn't speak to them. And I must say that this is not a left or right thing, some kind of psychosis. But you see this illusion that we can, like, you can redo the end of World War II, and the fact that they would not have anything to do with the Russian celebrations of the end of World War II. The wife of Gerhard Schröder, a prominent former prime minister, simply went to a reception at the Russian embassy commemorating the end of World War II. She was fired from her job. You do something as simple as go to a reception commemorating the end of the war, and you're banned. There's instance after instance like that. And it's really as if in their fantasy, they want to redo the end of World War II, only this time we and the Americans together. And so they're begging Trump to come back to Project Ukraine, come back and we'll spend all the money. And of course, you've got to realize that the European Union is run by the Germans, basically. They have the key positions of power in the European Union. And remember that the European Union was a Nazi project originally.
Right.
And it's very much that. I want to put in just a little word for another country on behalf of another country. The country that I love that is not like this is Italy. The Italians are having none of this, and there are demonstrations all the time. Never mind the government is. I'm not sure what the government is because Italian politics are. But I'm talking about the people. The Italian people are definitely opposed to this.
Do you think there's actually a movement towards a war between NATO and Russia? Do you think this is actually, let's say, a possible development because of these signs of what's happening in Germany?
The way I see it now is they don't really have the means now to make a war. That's why they're talking about putting in 5% of GDP to build up the military. Now, very many commentators who understand economics better, because one thing, I'm not an economist, and when you talk about money, I think I lose it. But people who know more than I do about economics say this is not possible. These countries can't afford to do that. The only country that is, France has a bigger military than the others, but Germany is saying it's going to be the big one. They are running this show. And of course, they have the little Baltic states. And the fact that they've put in charge of EU foreign policy, Kaja Kallas, this young woman from Estonia. Estonia doesn't have 2 million inhabitants, and she's supposed to speak for all the. Why? Because she's exactly what Ursula von der Leyen wants. So Macron goes along with this because he wants to be a great European. And that means basically following the Germans at this point, even though it's not in their interest at all. It's completely destructive. And this is why it's just crazy that they are on the. I mean, when you say infantilism, you can mean that you've just lost any business, any possibility of examining your own self-interest, and you just go into slogans. And that's what being childish is in the worst sense. Although some children are more reasonable than others, it really is infantile in the sense of, oh, we want to do this, we're going to do that because we want to do it. The fact that you can't do it doesn't even occur to them. So I don't think they're in the long run. This is dangerous because they're going to, whatever is left of Ukraine, they're still talking about they're going to arm it and keep it in order to harass the Russians forever. And they're trying to get other countries. I mean, you see, there's constant attacks on countries that aren't hating Russia. They're subverting Armenia. They've tried to subvert Georgia, but haven't succeeded. They're going after Moldova. And the worst, by the way, the worst subversive organization in the world, aside from Mossad, it's MI6. It's the British. They are in every bad trick you can imagine. If you remember this Skripal's case, which I won't bother with because it's too complicated, but it's a total fake. They can make up false flag operations, anything to keep this going. This makes no sense. I'm still hoping that some sane movement will rise.
It does seem that Trump has tried to work against this kind of war. I don't know where, I mean, Trump is always, he wanted to stop. He wanted to stop what was happening in Ukraine. He's quixotic or whatever, unpredictable, or just really not able to predict. I don't know what he will do, but it seems like it would be impossible to do this without the U.S. And I also wonder how Israel fits into all of this.
Israel is, when you see the figures of what they pay for campaigns, you know that Israel controls the U.S. Congress. And apparently Trump, too, more than I would have expected. But when it comes to Russia, if you look at the history of the neocon, what you call the neocons, which are really Zionists influencing U.S. policy, very many of them come from Eastern Europe. And they developed a hatred of Russia as a pogroms. And so some of this hostility, you take someone like Newland, and you see there a resentment that goes way, way back against Tsarist Russia. You see signs of that. And so actually, the funny thing is that you get these Zionists, anti-Russian Zionists, allied with the Germans that are nostalgic. It's irrational. When you can't discuss things, when there are taboos all over when you mustn't say that because if you say that, you're a Nazi or you're a fascist or something or other. I mean, Germany has this constitutional laws against extremism. Now, what in the hell is extremism? It means anything that isn't the dominant, whatever is dominant is called centrist, right? No matter, even if it means total war and everything. So people on the left or on the right who don't agree with this centrism are extremists, and there are laws against them. There are laws in Germany. They are tracked down and denounced and fired. Now, I will say this about the German courts. It happens very often. The court will say, no. The court will come out for freedom of it. But meanwhile, the person has lost their job, gone through the stress of court and scared most people into silence. So even though the courts often reverse these prosecutions, the damage is done because it creates an atmosphere where people are afraid to say things. And now, of course, there's this big difference. There is a lot of opposition in Germany that shows up in polls against this policy. So it's not all the German people; it's the German ruling class, and it is significant that objection to the war against Russia is strongest in East Germany. Now, after all, East Germany had more to do with the Russians than the West Germany. And yet they don't have this hatred in East Germany. In fact, some of them look back rather nostalgically for things that were benefits in East Germany. The hatred of Russia does not come from contact with the Russians, but from non-contact.
Right, right. Well, often that is the case anyway for hatred. Last week we did talk to this guy, Greg Lukianoff, and the canceling of the American mind. Cancel culture undermines trust and threatens us all. And so this is about exactly what you described, that you were describing in Germany has happened in America too, at our universities, and particularly in public institutions where people have lost their jobs. And more people in universities have lost their jobs, been canceled, than during McCarthyism. I mean, there were other aspects of McCarthyism, but this period of time that we're in has been the strongest period of time for collapsing free speech in American universities. And that also follows the same kind of thing that you're talking about. Some people then lose their jobs, and in the long run, they win their lawsuits, but their lives have been ruined. And in the meantime, everyone around them has been silenced because there's fear of what's going to happen if they speak out to support. And these are even on these weird, weird cases about biological sex, where people were saying, like, there is no such thing as biological sex. And then, a teacher who teaches that there is biology and sex loses her job and fights her case in court. Eventually, she wins the case, but everyone around her has continued to have to speak in a way that is completely dishonest and confusing, because all of the issues surrounding biological sex became so confusing and divisive that, even in my own friendship group, people turned against me because I believe in biological sex. Now, I would not have been able to imagine, even to imagine this. It is beyond rationality. It's beyond anything that I could have imagined. And yet there it is, and it's happening still. It's in a way, Trump being elected has made it easier to speak about these issues. Now people are able to speak at least.
Well, there are certain issues that may be easier to speak about, and now there are different issues which are verboten in this country. And I mean, for example, Trump ran, at least the first time, on ending war, called the wars that prior administrations had been fomenting stupid, called the people who led the country at the time stupid. So one has to wonder how we find ourselves where we are now with him wanting to engage. I mean, other than Ukraine, he's been fomenting wars. So he's lost a good chunk of his base because many people who voted for him assumed that the Democratic Party was going to go full steam into Ukraine and basically foment a nuclear war. So many people came out for Trump that may not have otherwise voted for him. I'm one of those people. And now, with what just happened with Iran, he's twisted himself into a pretzel. He's also not appeared publicly now for 8 days after the mess that he's just created. So,
You're talking about particularly the anti-war aspect of Trump's support.
yes,
And yet there is this other aspect. I didn't vote for Trump, but there is this other aspect of Trump's presence allowing for conversation about sex differences and the biology of sex that has shifted. And it's not that, it's partly that Trump came out very clearly and said there are two sexes, and that we're going to stop protecting men who are in women's sports. So that did shift that conversation, and that was a tremendous relief for me personally, because I mean, I'm sure I'm still in trouble with people for saying that, there is a biological difference. And that, I mean, to me, it was psychotic to say there was no difference. I mean, I felt like it was confusing at a fundamental level. So,
yes, he and his supporters spoke out against the quote woke left in their language and their shutting down free speech, or their perceived notion that they were shutting down free speech on the right. But now they've turned it around and they're doing exactly what they criticized to the left, with the exception on gender, because that aligns with their view of reality. But now there are other things we're not allowed to say, which are the opposite. We just flipped. The different set of ideas, values, and words are now illegal in the United States, and you jeopardize your job, your social standing, if you take a position that goes against this newspeak, to quote Orwell, because this is the time he predicted this so well, that if you cannot think clearly and you cannot use certain words, then certain thoughts become quite literally unthinkable. And it seems more and more this also connects, I think, with our interview with Ken Wilber, where Ken Wilber was talking about his interpretation of what was going on the woke left was a regression to infantilism, which is exactly what I hear you saying, Diana. And so in terms of the overall conversation about stage theory and awakening, I think it's I could argue pretty easily that what we're seeing is this collective regression to helplessness. And when I asked earlier about who benefited from these policies, for example, in France, ultimately it takes your eye off of where the power really is and what seems to be the agenda that you can see if you take a step back. Like, it isn't a shock if you understood, like you brought up Brzezinski and the grand chessboard. I mean, Brzezinski outlined this back during the Carter administration, where we were going to go into, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. So they're now putting the final keystone by going after Iran. But this has been a 50-plus year project in slow motion. But certain neoconservative members of the neoconservative group seem to have been able to institutionalize their policy, whether or not they're, quote, directly in power or not. So we see this with marginalizing Europe, with our attack on Iran, which could not have happened without Bush's policy of preemptive war after 9/11. These things were literally unthinkable 25 years ago. And it all changed with 9/11. It pivots with 9/11 in that these policies have all been legalized, where many Americans do not realize the incremental loss of liberty in this country.
I do see, well, the United States is a bigger country, so maybe it's not normal. I see more intelligent critics of policy in the United States than I see in France, for instance. I would say France is more thoroughly Zionized. It's true you have terrible things happening in universities, but you have a lot of critics. You have the trouble is in the United States there is is the political system. The political system is dominated by this two-party system that is influenced by money. And I think that has destroyed American democracy. I think that because you have intelligent people, you have good people, and they can't make a political movement out of it. You can't get on the ballot. Look at the Green Party's been around for ages, and it's only on half the ballots in the country, if I understand correctly. Now, in Europe, it's different. The political system is more open in the European countries. You can easily create a new party. It isn't as ruled by money, but the mentality and the infantile mentality on the gender issue, they're using it as an enemy, like they're using it against. When you have a national government like in Hungary, they use this gay pride. It's a sort of a battering ram against conservative or national identity. No, everybody, it's the hedonistic disintegration of society. The potential for change institutionally is greater in Europe, but the mentality is dreadful. And of course, meanwhile, the educational systems are declining. In France, there's less money for the schools, there's less money for the hospitals. And so talking about this huge military buildup, it's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen. People are not going to let that happen. In Germany, I don't know, because there's a big resistance, especially, but this party that expresses the resistance the most, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, it's a right-wing it's no more right-wing than Meritz's party, who is in power. The only thing that is really different is even that is not changing about criticism of immigration, free immigration. But the main thing is that the party doesn't want to go to war with Russia, and that makes it extreme right. That is what an extreme right. And Wagenknecht, who did not win the elections, was also against war with Russia. So that was the extreme left. So extreme in Germany means against war with Russia. I mean, it's insane. It is really crazy. And economically, it's disastrous for Germany, but of course, the big industries will move to the United States or somewhere.
It's going to be important to keep a focus on what's happening in Germany in order to understand what's going to happen overall in the bigger picture with NATO. And we didn't quite cover, or maybe we did, I don't know, where Israel fits, except for Mossad and
About how Israel fits. This is an important point that I wanted to make, and I'm glad you brought it up, because Germany has in its constitution that Israel is part of its raison d'etat. And I don't know what that means, but that means that you protect Israel like you protect Germany, and maybe more so. And you see, my analysis is the following: that by idealizing Jews and Israel, Germans find innocence for everything else they did in World War II. You see, by harping on, oh, we have to make it up to the Jews. They don't have to make it up to all the Slavic people that they killed. They don't have to make it up to the Russians, to the Soviets. You don't have to make it up to anybody, because you're so guilty about the Jews that you're innocent of everything else. And now the United States has found that useful, because they take up that because of the Holocaust, we have to make war to prevent it from happening again. So the Holocaust religion is useful to the United States, and it's very useful morally to the Germans, who are arming Israel like. But it's interesting, because in Germany you have some Jews who have come back who went to Israel and came back to Germany, and are very critical of Israel. And what do you know? The Jewish Association's Constitutional Protection Agency, June 13, classifies Jewish associations as extremist due to their critical stance on Israel. There's, as I say, the Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in the Middle East has been listed as foreign-related extremism. This is an organization of Jews for Peace, is branded by this Constitutional Protection Agency, which goes around deciding who's extremist.
wow.
And yes, here's Dr. Ghassan Abu Sita, just returned from Germany. He was denied entry. He's a Palestinian with British citizenship and director of the University of Glasgow, and they wouldn't let him in because he was going to tell about the things he had seen in a hospital in Gaza. So Germany would not allow him in. This sort of thing is happening all the time. All the time.
So there's a kind of return of the extremes to each other. I mean, as though the extremes are uniting again in a weird way.
But they aren't allowed to unite.
Well,
No. This is the thing on the left. The left has this attitude that you mustn't have anything to do with the right.
yeah. And that seems to be more on the left than on the right. I mean,
Exactly. It is.
It's some kind of stuckness, as Mike was saying about development. It's like people on the left arrived at a certain point, and then they got stuck there, feeling that they were morally superior to everybody else, and they haven't been able to recover from moral superiority.
And the term left and right are now completely meaningless. They really are completely meaningless. So, I do believe what you just said, Polly, really does characterize what we're referring to as the quote woke left. There's a moral self-righteousness that we know what the truth is, we know what reality is, we can define right and wrong. And if you don't see things the way we do, not only will we not talk to you, we're going to other you and attack you, silence you, ban you, and eventually expel you or put you in cages. That's what happens historically. So for example, in this country, it's I'm not going to say it's very clear to me, for somebody who's looked into these issues for quite a while now, there are certain, again, these footprints of where it does appear we're going. First, you make an enemy out of the illegal immigrant. You claim that they're killing everybody, they're raping your women, they're doing all sorts of horrible things, and they're all the same. There's not a single good person in any of these people. Like, there was a report yesterday, they rounded up over 2,000 Venezuelans. They're all in the gang. They're all murderers. There's not a single good person. And we could refer back to when this happened in the Old Testament, but I'm not going to go there. Is there not one good person? And there's been, I mean, we have been building these, quote, cages now for illegal immigrants. Both parties are doing this. So, for example, Diana, you mentioned, that there's a two-party system. I think there are many people who would argue there is not. There is only the party of money and power. We just saw an exception to that, though, in the mayoral race in New York City. And the only reason that happened, I believe, is because of ranked choice voting, which here in Missouri, for example, the Republicans, who have a supermajority and control the whole state, put forward a constitutional amendment to ban illegal immigrants from voting, which we didn't need. But in that amendment, which passed, it outlawed ranked choice voting. So both parties, wherever they are in the country, have worked together to make sure that Americans can't ever form an opposition and take power away, to your point.
Part of the problem when you say like the right and the left don't really exist, I mean, in a certain sense, we need words to describe what these different valences are. And the words that we still have would be like something like progressive and conservative or right and left or whatever. And there are differences between the groups, I think, because as we said a few moments ago, when I speak with conservatives, I do find a range of values that I don't find when I'm speaking with more progressive people. And I think the issue is the one we identified. I don't want to lose it before we end here: moral superiority. That when people embrace a kind of moral superiority, that they at that point are functioning through this primary emotion of disgust. They're disgusted by the other side, and at that point, you can dehumanize the other side. As soon as you believe that the other side is like animals, or the other side is Nazis, they're fascists, you can dehumanize them, and at that point, you can kill them, you can jail them with a certain kind of moral superiority. You believe you're doing the right thing. And that is, to me, the biggest concern about political leadership and the political groups that I see functioning in the US, and I think they're functioning in Europe also, is this sense of dehumanizing people because you disagree with them, but you don't still allow that they can have a point of view. And I do find that more on the progressive side than on the conservative side. In general, that's maybe a generalization, a stereotype, or whatever, but I find it so regularly. I don't want to just dismiss it. But that issue, whether it's moral superiority about who the other is, or it's moral superiority about having the right idea, it still results in dehumanizing other people. And that's what I've seen as a huge development. And as Diana was saying, and again, this has been my experience too. It's really affected even the practice of science. That it affects everything. That there's no longer the ability to determine through dialogue, debate, argument, how to establish truth. And then that leads to tremendous confusion on the part of many people who are trying to figure out which is the right side. I mean, even in regard to science, and that's the I think biology was very much affected. The practice of biology in universities was affected by this whole gender thing. and students became confused. And I supervise in psychiatry at the University of Vermont, and I've talked to students who were confused about sex and and gender. So, anyway, I want to bring us around to recognizing the issues that we're talking about, which I think are important to keep in mind in terms of how we deal with differences and with humanity, and with that sense of being able to be open to dialogue, and that there's a very big crisis going on. There's no question about it, and it's going on in the United States and in Europe. I think that what's happening in regard to Russia is very worrisome, and I don't want to lose track of that. And I know we're ending soon, so I want to make sure that Diana gets a chance to say something, and you, Mike, and then Diana has stayed with us even with this terrible heat.
Well, I would like to make my last word and give up, but and that is just to emphasize what you're saying too. Do you see what is terrible is that this absence of dialogue is absolutely like glass. The one goes up and the other goes down. When dialogue goes down, violence goes up. That is what I last want to emphasize. Because when you don't have dialogue, you have somebody taking out a knife and stabbing somebody else because all they understand is force, right? And this is where I see it going here. You see more and more incidents of violence. There's no doubt to me that it's you limit dialogue and you favor violence, period, whether it's war or personal violence in a domestic setting.
Absolutely. That's so well stated. It's so concise that when you actually limit dialogue, you increase violence, and that's absolutely true at every level for human beings, at every level, because you know, it's like we have to recognize that each of us has a different perspective and that we have to tolerate those differences, or we don't recognize our humanity where we have that possibility of dialogue where the dogs just have to fight. We could talk, but when we don't, then we turn into the dogs. Then we fight. That really is true across the board.
I think that's a really important point. And the antidote to that is for anybody listening to go out and speak to people you don't agree with and try to hear what they're saying and where and how they've developed their point of view. And that if we can't listen to even the people closest to us that we don't agree with, it's pretty clear where we're going to end up. So the change begins with each one of us, with being able to tolerate even extreme differences without taking it personally. And that's the individual challenge I'll put out to our listeners, is try to have and engage in dialogue with people you don't agree with and try to hear where they're coming from and maybe empathize with their life experience that has led them to see the world the way they do. Without us each trying to make a difference and civilize our discussions, we're going to wind up falling prey to the propaganda that has us fear and hate. So the choice is really up to each one of us. How are we going to respond to these times right now? We can each cower in fear and put bigger locks on our doors and get guns, or we can approach each other with empathy and compassion and love and humility and curiosity. And I think this is one of the recurring themes in our conversations about trying to approach each other with don't know mind, with curiosity and humility, and try to tamp down the escalation in interpersonal violence, even as simple as smiling at strangers. It makes a difference. You may not see it, but it makes a difference.
And so I want to smile now at Diana Johnstone because I am so grateful that we have a chance to talk to you again. And I know that it's a sacrifice to do this in a very, very big heat wave in Paris. And so I'm grateful. I'm grateful for your knowledge. I'm grateful for your career. It's been an extraordinary privilege to speak to you. And I look forward to speaking to you again.
Well, I thank you very much for your kind words and for all you're doing and for the good cause of dialogue, and it's a pleasure to me. I wasn't suffering. I'll go back tonight. I'll probably suffer. I'm trying to sleep, but right now I'm awake, and thank you very much.
So thank you, Diana, and I hope to see you again sometime soon. Blessings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed this episode of Waking Up Is Not Enough? Flourishing in the Human Space? Please consider supporting Waking Up Is Not Enough by contributing to our GoFundMe campaign. You can find the campaign linked in the description. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode of insightful discussions and explorations into the human psyche. Waking Up Is Not Enough was edited and produced by Chris Coltrane.